Welcome to the debate where we delve into the intricate layers of meaning within substantive source material. Today we're plunging into the profound depths of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, a novel that, well, it continues to puzzle and provoke readers centuries later.
Absolutely. And our central question today is one that really gets to the heart of Raskolnikov's infamous act. Was his murder of the old pawnbroker fundamentally an application of his, chilling extraordinary man theory? Or was it actually a desperate breakdown driven by his dire circumstances and, extreme psychological distress?
Right, and I find myself drawn more to the idea that the crime was a deliberate, albeit profoundly flawed, philosophical experiment.
And I, on the other hand, I'm convinced his actions were primarily a desperate breakdown, a tragic consequence of material deprivation and psychological torment, with his theories serving more as maybe a twisted coping mechanism than a true impetus.
Well, let me lay out why I see it that way. Raskolnikov's crime, as detailed in the source material, it really presents itself as a deliberate, if deeply flawed, philosophical experiment. He conceived of this act not out of simple, immediate necessity, but as a severe test of his own will, and a transgression he believed could be justified by a higher, sort of utilitarian purpose. The text shows him explicitly preparing for what he calls a general rehearsal of his undertaking. That phrase alone, it signals the calculated, almost scientific nature of his philosophical venture.
What's more, he later confides in Sonia with stark clarity that it wasn't a human creature I killed, but a principle. That profoundly emphasizes the ideological, rather than purely personal or pragmatic, core of his act. His extensive articulation of this theory to Porfirio Petrovich, where he discusses the right of extraordinary men to overcome certain obstacles for an idea useful to all mankind, citing figures like Napoleon, it clearly positions his actions within a sophisticated intellectual framework. Even his rejection of the money after the crime and his statement to Sonia, "If necessity alone had driven me to the murder, I would be happy now," that directly indicates a motivation beyond mere economic survival. It points instead to a profound, if distorted, philosophical conviction. It's a chilling, early exploration of what happens when moral relativism is pushed to its extreme. A stark warning about intellectual hubris that, frankly, still resonates.
My perspective, however, takes a rather different turn. Raskolnikov's act, in my view, was primarily a desperate breakdown, triggered by overwhelming material deprivation, the profound suffering of his family, and his own severe, deteriorating mental and physical state. His extraordinary man theory, I would argue, served more as a diluted rationalization, or maybe even a symptom of his psychological collapse, rather than the true impetus for the crime. The text repeatedly emphasizes his fainting heart and a body agitated by nervous trembling, his sensation of immense disgust, and how he walked on the sidewalk like a drunkard.
Right. The physical descriptions are powerful.
Exactly. In his mother's letter, which explicitly details his sister Dunya's impending marriage as a sacrifice, she is selling herself for her mother, selling herself for her brother. That acts as a direct trigger, forcing him to act at any cost. Even Porfirio Petrovich himself seems to understand Raskolnikov's state, observing his nerves are excited, they are unhealthy, and his bile, suggesting the crime was a manifestation of a profound psychological crisis, exacerbated, of course, by his squalid living conditions in his tiny 6-foot room. The suffering, the desperation, the physical decay, these feel like the undeniable forces pushing him to the edge.
Okay, so, having laid out our initial perspectives, it's clear there are some fundamental disagreements here that warrant closer examination. Let's dive into the core tensions that emerge from the text, starting with perhaps the most tangible aspect, the question of Raskolnikov's state of mind during the crime itself. Let's call it premeditation and rationality versus delirium and impulse.
Okay.
I maintain that Raskolnikov's meticulous planning, like counting the 700 steps to the pawnbroker's house when his project was no more than a vague dream, and devising the running knot for his axe, this underscores a calculated, albeit morally warped rationality. His initial hesitation and self-reproach, far from indicating impulse, were I think due to his lack of energy and his irresolution in executing his grand plan, not an indictment of the plan itself. He saw himself as an actor without conviction in his previous attempt, suggesting the role was difficult to embody, not that the script was unsound. This isn't the impulsive act of a madman, it's the struggle of a man trying to live up to his own formidable intellectual construct, a kind of chilling dedication to an idea.
See, I simply don't buy that. The notion of meticulous planning feels consistently overwhelmed by Raskolnikov's profound physical and psychological symptoms. The text explicitly states that he did not believe the day would ever come when his vague dream would become action, and with every step his agitation increased. His premeditation was consistently a battle against his own deteriorating state, and frankly, a losing battle at that. The actual killing was described as impulsive and done mechanically, as if he had no strength. His immediate post-crime disorientation, forgetting to take money or dispose of the axe properly, that clearly illustrates a mind in disarray, not a rational actor. He later admits, in a moment of clarity after his rehearsal, that the mere thought of such a thing terrified me. This terror and his physical weakness, they directly contradict the image of a coldly rational, calculating individual. How can we call this a calculated philosophical experiment when the agent himself is so completely undone by the very act he supposedly orchestrated?
That's a strong point about his post-crime disarray, I'll grant you that. But I would suggest that even in his physical and mental collapse, the underlying framework of his philosophical experiment remained. What you interpret as complete breakdown, I see as the cost of a radical philosophical act. He knew the risks, perhaps, he simply underestimated his own human weakness in facing them. The planning, however faltering the execution might have been, still speaks to a mind trying to enact a theory. If it were pure delirium, would there be this sustained internal monologue, this self-assessment of his own lack of energy in the face of his project? Doesn't the very language he uses, referring to his undertaking and grand plan, suggest a mind still operating within a specific intellectual framework, even if that framework is being violently tested?
But the question isn't whether he had an intellectual framework. It's whether that framework drove the act or merely rationalized it as his mind crumbled. The profound physiological responses, the terror, the mechanical nature of the killing, these are not the hallmarks of a man executing a rational experiment. These are the symptoms of a psyche under immense, unbearable strain. The planning itself feels more like obsessive rumination born of his illness, perhaps, a cyclical thought pattern rather than a coherent blueprint for action. He was pushed to a breaking point, and his theory provided a convenient, albeit diluted, narrative to process the horror. His lucidity, when it appears, often feels like a desperate attempt to reassert control over a reality that has utterly overwhelmed him.
While this distinction between driving force and rationalization leads us quite naturally to our next crucial point of disagreement, the extraordinary man as a true belief versus a desperate rationalization.
Right?
I maintain that Raskolnikov's elaborate and well-articulated extraordinary man theory, detailed even to an interrogator like Porfirio, signifies a deeply held philosophical conviction. His conviction that he killed a principle and not merely a person profoundly emphasizes an ideological rather than purely pragmatic drive. He consciously frames his action within a grand narrative, distinguishing it from common criminality. And his stark statement to Sonia, "If necessity alone had driven me to the murder, I would be happy now," directly refutes economic necessity as his primary motivation. His suffering, in his own words, is not for the act itself, but for his failure to transcend ordinary morality as his theory demanded. It's a dangerous philosophy, absolutely, but genuinely held, making his actions a chilling logical conclusion of his thought.
That's a compelling argument, and I agree his theory is elaborate, but have you considered that Raskolnikov's theory might be a sophisticated psychological defense mechanism? A desperate rationalization that emerged precisely because of his dire circumstances. His crushing poverty, his mother's sacrifices, Sonia's forced prostitution due to their material conditions. These were the raw, visceral pressures that forced him, perhaps to seek a grander meaning for what was, at its core, a desperate act. His delirium and uneasy smile while explaining his theory to Sonia, they betray a mind under extreme duress, not one of stable conviction. He himself eventually admits to her, "I'm not telling things as they are," suggesting his intellectual justifications are not entirely genuine or stable, but rather a twisting of reality to suit his desperate need to justify the horror he has committed. He was, as he confesses, exasperated. And that rage fueled his intellectual self-deception, not some calm philosophical pursuit.
I'm not convinced his intellectual engagement is merely a coping mechanism, though. To construct such a complex theory, to apply it with such rigor, even in a distorted state, it suggests more than mere rationalization. If it were just a defense mechanism, why the intense internal torment after the fact, specifically about his failure to be truly extraordinary, rather than an immediate, overwhelming moral guilt about the victim? The novel doesn't describe him seeking solace in the theory as much as being tormented by his inability to live up to its demands. He believed in it, I think, and that belief drove him to a test he couldn't pass, leaving him with a profound intellectual humiliation, not simply a practical one. It's a key distinction. His suffering comes from falling short of his own internal philosophical standard, not from violating a conventional one.
But his internal torment, while certainly complex, is entirely consistent with a breakdown where the theory itself is a symptom of that breakdown. The fact that he tries to justify it, that he clings to the idea of being extraordinary, even as he is physically and mentally disintegrating, well, that's evidence of his mind's desperate attempt to make sense of an unbearable act. The humiliation he feels isn't just intellectual. It's the humiliation of facing the raw, human consequences of what he has done, and realizing his grand theory could not protect him from those consequences. His confession that he's not telling things as they are to Sonia is incredibly telling. It suggests an underlying awareness, however suppressed, that his intellectual edifice is, well, maybe a lie. The theory serves the breakdown. It doesn't precede or transcend it.
Which brings us, I suppose, to our final and perhaps most profound point of disagreement: remorse for the act versus remorse for the failure to be extraordinary.
Exactly.
I argue that Raskolnikov's internal struggle was not primarily moral guilt, but rather frustration over his personal inadequacy. He explicitly states in prison that he did not repent of his crime and insists his conscience is tranquil. His distress, therefore, was not from taking a life, but from failing to prove himself as a truly extraordinary man, capable of transcending conventional morality without internal torment. He believed that he who has a conscience suffers in recognizing his error, that is, his punishment, independently of penal servitude, implying his suffering was his personal failure to be above such remorse. He was humiliated by his failure to be an exceptional individual, not by the act of murder itself. He laments not his victim, but his own weakness in the face of his radical philosophy.
I approach this from another angle entirely. Raskolnikov's intense, immense disgust and terror immediately after the crime speak to a genuine, if unacknowledged, moral torment. His feverish dreams in the hospital, where he sees the whole world ravaged by a terrible and unprecedented plague, where men killed each other under the impulse of blind rage, that clearly demonstrates a mind processing the horrific implications of his actions on a universal scale, far beyond just his personal failure. This isn't merely about his ego. It's about the profound moral corruption he has unleashed and the fundamental breakdown of humanity he seems to foresee. His later realization that he detested Sonia after having contributed to her suffering, and his deep melancholy when discussing the suffering of truly great men, suggest a profound, subconscious grappling with guilt that his intellectual pride prevents him from openly acknowledging. He recognizes the immense suffering that real change-makers endure, a stark contrast to his own self-serving, albeit philosophically framed act.
But even in those terrifying dreams, is his concern truly for the moral transgression,
Or is it a terrifying projection of a world without his kind of order? A world where the extraordinary man fails to impose his will? His distress seems to be about the ensuing chaos, the breakdown of society, because no true extraordinary men step forward to guide it, rather than a direct personal guilt overtaking two lives. His language consistently returns to his own inadequacy, his own failure, which points more to a deeply ingrained philosophical framework that he could not embody, rather than a dawning moral conscience. He laments his own humanity, perhaps, not the crime itself.
I'd argue the chaos is the ethical transgression he's grappling with. His subconscious mind grapples with the destruction he initiated and the universal implications of his act. The fact that his intellectual pride prevents him from acknowledging this guilt directly doesn't negate its presence. The deep, visceral reactions, the horror, the dreams, these are the language of a conscience struggling to break through the intellectual defenses. He may say his conscience is tranquil, but the narrative offers abundant evidence to the contrary. His suffering isn't just intellectual humiliation. It's the profound, inescapable weight of having taken a life. A weight his extraordinary man theory was supposed to make him immune to, but utterly failed to do so. The sheer scale of his internal torment after the crime suggests a far deeper moral struggle than simply disappointment in his own performance.
So, as we conclude our debate today, it is clear that Raskolnikov's motivation for the murder in Crime and Punishment is not a simple matter. Dostoevsky masterfully weaves together layers of possibility. I have presented a case for the intellectual and philosophical underpinnings of his crime, highlighting his theory of extraordinary men and his desire to transcend conventional morality. His persistent articulation of this theory, even in the face of his own torment, suggests a deeply ingrained conviction, a chilling glimpse into the mind that attempts to justify the unjustifiable through intellectual abstraction.
However, I have argued, I hope persuasively, that Raskolnikov's actions were inextricably linked to his dire economic conditions and a profound psychological breakdown, with his theories serving as a desperate coping mechanism rather than a primary driver. The visceral reactions, the physical and mental deterioration described in the text, point to a man utterly overwhelmed by his circumstances, grasping at a grand theory to rationalize the unspeakable.
Indeed. The source material offers a wealth of evidence supporting both interpretations, demonstrating the complex interplay of ideas, circumstance, and psychological state in shaping human behavior. Ultimately, Dostoevsky leaves us to ponder how much Raskolnikov was a product of his radical, dangerous intellect.
And how much he was a tragic victim of his crushing reality.
Exactly. The rich tapestry of his internal and external struggles ensures that these questions remain fertile ground for continued exploration, reminding us that the human psyche is rarely driven by a single, simple motive.